Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
This month, she brought one to him. Last month there had been 3, and the month before that 2. There was no pattern, and Susie couldn't predict how many strays her son would need this time. Sometimes he could do without for months on end. But he never managed to abstain for longer than 4 or 5, and each time was a true ordeal, a curse for Susie. It all started with Mike becoming more restless. He would lose his appetite, become cranky, and increasingly damage things. Anything could get under his strong, angry hands, which could smash things so badly that it was frightening to approach. A book he tore to shreds, dishes he threw at the walls. Once he got to a pair of scissors and cut the curtains to shreds. Susie nearly had a heart attack. When she saw her son holding a sharp knife, she wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for him, her unwise child. "Mom, I want to see," he whispered and looked past her. "Mother, I must see." She knew what such words meant and, swallowing her tears, stroked his head each time. "Okay, be patient, my bunny. Mommy will soon bring you the right person, but you have to wait a little bit." "Okay. Mommy has to go to work." "Okay. Usually Mike agreed to wait, and then she had a couple days to find a suitable candidate. But sometimes his son would get sick in front of her eyes, and he'd start breathing heavily, mumbling some gibberish under his breath. His face would turn red, and his eyes? Oh, at such times it seemed to Susie that it was not her child she was looking at. "I have to, mama. Ring me. I want to, I have to." And then she'd get out of her seat and go looking for what he needed without a moment's hesitation. And I don't care if she misses work. There, by the way, knew that her son has a mental deviation and treated with delicate understanding. Good people. How grateful Susie was to her native factory accounting department, where she was not fired when her family was in a nightmare situation, and she had become an employee who could no longer fulfill her duties perfectly. She was well aware, after all, that a single mother with 2 children, one of whom was crazy, would not be welcome anywhere. Another aggravation came just before her daughter's birthday, Catherine's 17th birthday. "Again?" Catherine asked, catching her mother on the doorstep at 10 o'clock at night. Susie was silently buttoning her boots. She was going to walk to the track only 20 minutes from their house on the outskirts and in the realm of the underprivileged, where she was already well known. She didn't go there often, but regularly brought something for the locals to eat. Sometimes she'd drop off old clothes or some other trash they could use. In fact, she had once thought that a stray girl could be found easily, just a snap of the fingers, a lure of anything, and she would go. After all, the need of a desperate situation better than any organ will be better. But it turned out that bums, people, sheets, and cautious. "I'm not going anywhere," Auntie told her that first girl. "That was 3 years ago. What if you're luring me to a maniac?" grinned the tramp. And it must have been a lot to read on Susie's face, because the tramp frowned and stepped farther away. But then Susie pulled herself together. "No, I'm not taking you to a maniac," she said. "It's just that this is a very delicate issue, and no one but you can help me here. I'm looking for a homeless girl. Let me explain on the way." At my house, she made another argument. "I made dinner of stuffed cabbage and apple pie. You can use my bathroom, and I'll give you new clean clothes." Then the girl went with her. And it was later, looking back, that Susie grinned wickedly to herself. Oh, how hard the first time had been for her. And then, when she had lost track of the homeless, the girls her son demanded. Then they became a gray mass for her, faceless. She just brought them in and didn't get so nervous anymore. They came and went. She didn't memorize them. What did it matter? Each one was for a one-time use, of a speak anyway. "Yes, again," Susie said to her daughter, straightening up and wrinkling her aching back. "It's about time. Only 38 years old. And already everything hurts like an ancient grandmother." "Mom, can I?" said her daughter in a whining voice. "We better sit in a cafeteria and not at home." "Am I a millionaire in your opinion?" threw irritated Susie. "We've already agreed. The cake in your pastry shop inexpensive. Buy you a new sweater, 100 of them in your closet, and they all fit like a sack. You don't know anything about fashion trends. Catherine rolled her eyes. It's an oversize. That's what everyone's wearing these days. Herd mentality be damned, Susie muttered, checking that she had everything. Today, the homeless had soup on a chicken bone set and a dozen loaves of yesterday's bread, bought for half price at the bakery near the house. It's better to be like everyone else than to be so original that the whole entrance frightens away from us like the plague. My daughter burst into flames. Do you know that nobody wants to go to my birthday party? One best friend is left, and she moves away from me because I smell like a hobo. Don't be ridiculous, Susie said calmly but sternly. Oh, nonsense. Catherine's face turned pink. The whole neighborhood knows we've got a bed and breakfast open. In addition to the Nuff House, Catherine's speech was cut off abruptly. She realized that the last thing she had said was unnecessary. She had overstepped the silently established boundaries. Her mother was now looking at her coldly hard. I'm sorry. Catherine lowered her head. I didn't mean to. Did you say what you thought, daughter? Answered Susie, and how you feel. But he's your brother, my son. And you and I are not gonna have another family. So, Susie rustled her purse and pulled out her wallet and placed some bills on the nightstand. Take it. You and your girlfriend go to your cafe. And at home you don't want to celebrate with us, but you don't have to. Happy birthday, daughter. Take in advance. Best wishes. Susie finished and left the apartment, slamming the door loudly. Down the stairs from the 5th floor, because there is no elevator. Yap, yap, yap. A pair of pugs greeted her as she walked up the stairs. Good evening. Their owner said hello. Good evening, Alex, Susie replied. And without looking at him, she continued downstairs. He gave her a thoughtful look. What an interesting woman. Once again, the man thought. They've been neighbors for 2 years now, ever since he'd moved into the apartment he'd inherited from his grandfather. The old man had been living with them for the last few years. Alex's family had a small but quite successful farm in the village, supplying many varieties of cheeses and dairy products to the market in the city stores to private customers. His parents expected Alex, as a loving son, to continue the family business. But there was a conflict of interest because he all his life, from childhood literally, wanted to be an artist. And he made only one correction when he grew up. He decided to do digital illustration as well, so that he could expand his working opportunities, keeping up with the times. But Alex didn't think he was giving his family a family because he had 2 brothers, an older brother and a younger brother, and they just about decided to go into farming, cheese making, and all those other things. Today, Alex was already 26 years old, and so far he was quite happy with the way his life was going. And even his parents had accepted his choice, and his mother and grandmother even praised his relatives. Here, they say, what a creative person is in their family. As for the neighbor, Alex at first treated her warily and even a little hostile. Thank you, as they say to other neighbors who explain what to what. She was out of her mind when her husband died. Baba Zoya told him. The main house gossip. A tragedy happened in the forest. Her husband died. Baba Zoya raised her finger in an important way. Susie seemed fine, and then she took homeless people to her place, thinking it was charity. Zoya spat under the feet of herself and her interlocutor. How are we normal people supposed to live with him? I'm asking. It's an outrage. Alex, whose apartment was located in the same entrance 1 floor below. This situation, of course, could not help but make him tense. But then he found out the truth. And the truth began with the fact that he was at a bookstore doing an autograph session. Just released in the publishing house book, over the numerous and gorgeous illustrations of which he had been working for the past year. It was an adventure fantasy novel designed for a teenage audience, and then Susie's daughter came to get an autograph. Catherine was absolutely thrilled when she learned that the artist who gave such vivid images, her favorite characters, with his illustrations, helped to bring the reader's imagination of the magical world to life. And he is her neighbor. Alex signed the book for her. And a few days later, Catherine rang his doorbell. The little girl babbled embarrassedly about whether he would be so kind. Would it be a bother for him? Anyway, she brought in a stack of books. It was New Year's Eve. And it turned out that Catherine wanted to give some of her friends an original gift, a copy of a novel, each signed and personalized with a personalized wish from the author of the illustrations. Sign here, please, Nick Hamster, she asked. Homyaku, the artist raised an eyebrow. An original surname. Yes, it's a nickname, smiled Catherine. He just loves pizza, donuts, chips. And here he has eaten up since the 3rd grade already like a hamster. He won't be offended. No, he's used to it. He's got a good sense of humor. When the books were done, Alex invited Catherine to have tea with him. The girl's enthusiastic interest almost sparked the air around her, so Alex decided to be polite. They had tea. He showed Catherine his workplace, a table with a special slanted under the spoon for drawing, numerous paints, pencils, and sketches. And it is difficult to become an artist, asked the girl. Probably you need to have a great natural talent. In fact, as they say in our environment, answered Alex, 90% of labor and only 10 talent. Do you paint yourself? Yes, Catherine nodded, embarrassed. I would like to be an artist, but my mom says that after school I should go to law school. She wrung her hands nervously. She doesn't listen to me at all. Your mom must be having a hard time. Carefully, the man said. And then somehow word got around, but Catherine told him how they lived, complained about her brother. Alex only shook his head when he heard the real reasons why homeless girls were taken to him. Poor kid, he said. No wonder you keep it a secret. I'll have him like a pyramid, he nodded. We're already considered crazy. Catherine snorted. And I'll have to live with that stigma for the rest of my life. Aren't you looking too far ahead? Do you think things can still change? A lot of things happen in life sometimes, but you know, the important thing is to keep your head up. And then there's word of mouth. And it just so happened that first of all, he suggested we switch to the first name and just call them Alex. And secondly, she asked him to visit her sometimes to teach her how to draw. That is, she hinted, and he himself offered her private lessons, free of charge, and drawing materials from him. But this was all decided to be kept secret from Catherine's mother. The girl said that she would be against such visits and generally said that it was necessary to concentrate on school studies and not on pictures. Alex agreed to this little conspiracy because he remembered from personal experience what it was like to have hobbies in which you were not supported by your relatives. However, he tried to get closer, to be friends with Susie. But of course, without mentioning Catherine's hobbies or his friendship with her. And now they sometimes said hello, exchanged general phrases. Several times he helped her carry heavy bags from the store. And once, when her son's tooth suddenly collapsed at night, he drove them in his car to a 24-hour dentist's office. But it didn't work out much more than that. In the sense that Susie had kept a little aggressive and detached since her husband's death, not letting anyone get close to her family, and she wasn't going to change much about it, and he wasn't going to insist. This time she brought a newcomer. This tramp looked to be in her 20s or 40s. Her face was covered with wrinkles and dark spots. And on the way home, she told Susie all about how she'd gone to work to harvest the crops, but they didn't pay her, and how she had a flatmate, a drunken ex-millionaire. Susie didn't listen much. It was only the first vagrants that interested her. And then she began to see them as parts of the construction kit Mike liked to play with. Here we are, Susie said, entering the apartment and leading the girl to the door, her son's room. The key, the lock. Is he violent? The homeless woman sniffed her nose. He's my son. He's a good boy, Susie replied. He just has special needs. Sometimes it's better for him not to go out alone, so that nothing happens. He has those special times, but we're with you. She looked stern. We agreed on everything. That's right, isn't it? It was a little more complicated with this tramp, but it wasn't new. It's just that not everyone agreed to come when they were promised a warm night's sleep, food, and a few things. Many needed money, and Susie couldn't offer much. From where? They were, as they say, teetering on the edge of poverty, but sometimes you had to splurge. Like this time, goodbye, new boots, demi-seasonal. I'll have to put these in for repair. Again, the master already looked with pity at the boots and their owner too. But Susie was ready to do anything for her son. The tramp snorted, walked into the room, and closed the door behind her. Susie sighed and went to the kitchen to make herself some tea. It was going to be a long night. She would not open the door to her son's room until after dawn, when he had finished his ritual. Yes, perhaps what was going on with his mother's tacit approval and his sister's squeamish indifference could be called a ritual. It had all started when Mike had been released from the psychiatric hospital. At the time, Susie thought she could breathe a sigh of relief. Cure, right? But it was more complicated than that. But they were lucky to have a psychiatrist in the first place. He was a specialized specialist who ran his own private practice with a small clinic. They got to him, as they call it, by acquaintance, acquaintance with Brad was Susie's husband, and here, apparently out of respect for the deceased and sympathy to his widow. The treatment at this facility was absolutely free for Mike, and then Brad invited her into his office for a private conversation and told her how things were going. Trying to be as tactful as possible and avoiding terms that are difficult for laymen to understand, he said that Mike had a specific form of PTSD, a complication of some of his mental health traits that had been there all along. "Have you heard of Asperger's syndrome?" he asked. "Yes, it has been suggested in us," she replied, "but my son always had something else, so it started after a year." "That's right," Brad nodded, "but I'm afraid it's hard to paint an accurate picture. But I'll try." And the picture was not a good one. First of all, according to Brad, Susie's son didn't need any practical medication, except for some herbal sedatives to keep his body from reacting so violently to what his brain was doing. Secondly, Brad insisted that the boy would be best served by homeschooling, because Mike's mind was simply brilliant, sharp, and alive in traditional schools. He didn't belong. But if Susie could find the money for tutors with a narrow pedagogical specialization, if she herself could devote time to the boy, there was a chance that Mike would be able to finish school. And then, in a few years, when he's past adolescence. "What are you saying? That my son will just outgrow it?" Susie grinned bitterly. "Like a milk allergy?" "You could say that," cautiously, Brad continued. "But I strongly advise you, so that we can maintain the positive results we have achieved, you must create a special atmosphere for your son and stick to a certain routine. I will help you and give you all the guidance you need." And for the first year, everything was fine. Mike, to whom after the incident finally returned coherent speech, could already read books by himself and walked with pleasure, not faltering from people on the streets. And he loved numbers, just given something to count. But then his nightmares came back. Susie woke up to the boy's screams, ran to him, turned on the light and told him it was just a bad dream. "It's all right, my baby." And then Mike started telling her and his sister that he could see people, but not like the others. Not with his eyes, but in a different way. He said he could see what they call an aura, that he could read the past and the present. And at some point, he started pestering passersby, random people in the store. "Auntie, do you want the truth?" asked a 9-year-old boy and smiled warmly. What truth did any woman say, not expecting a trick from such a charming blonde, clear-eyed boy? And he would begin to say such things. Quotations of philosophers of the ancient world he mixed with lines of poems of poets of the past, and he'd add strange, charade-like phrases. He used chains of seemingly unrelated words, drawing with them like an artist paints associations with the past of the person he saw with his inner sight. And of course, the people around him were not happy about it. Susie tried to forbid Mike to behave that way, but when he got into night tantrums, he would smash everything around him. He demanded that he needed to talk to a person. He needed to see a person. And of course, Susie wanted Brad's help. But the trouble was, he'd suddenly gone overseas for advanced training. He left a deputy in his place, and he said he didn't support his colleagues' views. And there's only one cure for that, and that's more sedatives and more drugs. Susie agreed in desperation and almost lost her son. Mike became thin, withdrawn and silent. He didn't read. He wasn't interested in anything. It was like he was in a stupor and melting away. "That's good," said Deputy Brad. "What's good?" Susie asked. "Where's my son? What did you do to him?" You have an unhealthy child, and a mentally handicapped child. It will be normal for him to exist in a vegetable until death," the doctor said harshly. Susie wanted her Mike to be cured, but not in the same way. So she resolutely refused further treatment, and Mike was soon himself again. But there was still a problem. It was his need to talk. Susie couldn't have him bothering the people around him. They already looked askance at her family. And then one day she found a solution to her problem. Just one day they went to the market. Smita was distracted picking out tomatoes for a homemade slider, and Mike's mouth sniffed away. When Susie came to her senses and went looking for him, she was oh so scared, and how surprised she was to find him near the dumpster in the company of some homeless woman. She was sitting there, munching on a raisin bun, which, by the way, Susie had bought for herself and her children for tea, and listening to Mike's stream of speech. The first impulse was to grab, shake, and tell off. "You talk funny." The homeless woman grinned, showing the lack of front teeth. "And noisy how? You know all this about everyone." "Your boy, Mama." She turned to Susie. "He's mine," she answered absent-mindedly and clutched Mike's hand as tightly as if he might turn into a sparrow and fly away from her. "Take care of him," the homeless woman sighed. "They come into our world for a reason. They can see more than our ordinary people." Susie hurried her son away, but then he was calm again. He was relaxed, and at some moments he could even sing like an ordinary child. And then Susie's mind flashed like lightning. An idea came to her. What if she could find Mike some listeners from the homeless like this? What were they offered? Food, and they'll do anything you say. So she took a chance. And it turned out that Mike was very happy to have a listener like that. But there were nuances. First of all, he preferred to communicate only with women and not very old. Because, as he said himself, old people had long lives and too much to see everything. Secondly, Mike didn't want to talk to the same person twice. He needed a new one each time. At first, Susie thought of taking her son to the homeless, but she knew for sure that wasn't safe. And Mike wanted to talk for a long time. He rarely talked for half an hour. He could talk for 3, 4, or even 6 hours. That's when she decided it was okay to bring the homeless in, and Susie wasn't going to answer to anyone. In general, she was almost indifferent to the opinion of others. She had already heard where the grief came to the family, when there were among her neighbors so clever that they suggested, to surrender the insane son in an orphanage to have a chance to quietly bring up her daughter and happily married. What it cost Susie to keep from punching the unceremonious counselors in the face. "He may be crazy," her daughter told her, "but he's our psycho, Mom, and we're not gonna let him get hurt." Yes, Catherine, however tired she might be at times, Susie knew that. She loved her little brother very much because they were truly family. They were family, only they had each other. Yes, they were very lonely, painfully lonely. I mean, sure, theoretically there was kinship, but in essence. Susie's parents had been killed in a car accident long ago, back when Catherine was a baby. Her husband lost his father in childhood and was brought up by his mother, who after that tragic incident, her mother-in-law turned away from them. Just like that, she cut them out of her life. And the reason was hurtful, evil, unfair. And Susie always didn't understand. But how could it have occurred to her? The thing was, the mother-in-law was unwavering. Sure that Catherine wasn't her son's own daughter, that Susie had her on the side, just like Mike. And it was, of course, easily disprovable nonsense. Susie offered to do a genetic test to confirm the parentage. But her mother-in-law said she wouldn't believe it because it was all nonsense. It's your science, and you can fake the results. By the experts. Susie then literally laughed in her face, and she gave the last trump card, after which Susie thought that the mother-in-law, perhaps a little crazy herself. "I've heard of telegony." Joan asked with a wry squint. "I know that you didn't come to my son as a girl, that you were a whore before him. So yes, it will be known to you that if a woman, with whom she was before a man, from whom she had children, her children will be, in fact, from those first lovers of her Bragans, and not from the man on whom they were written down." "What are you saying?" Your eyes are rounded, Susie. "It's a scientifically proven fact." Lips tightened. "Mother-in-law." "Proven by whom?" "By whom?" You know what, hissed Susie, who was shaking, so hurt by her mother-in-law. "If we're talking about dissimilarity, it's Leo, who's nothing like you. I just don't believe that such an evil, mean, ugly aunt could give birth to such a kind, intelligent, and caring person." Joan froze then, her face contorted strangely. Susie even felt creepy, as if her mother-in-law's eyes had looked at her for a moment with different, alien, cold, almost inhuman eyes. And then the mother-in-law, as if she woke up, snorted in her usual manner and left. Then Susie's husband found out about the whole affair. He went and talked to his mother, literally took her by the hand to make peace with Susie. And it seemed like peace was restored to the family. And then that same summer, when they came from out of town to visit her mother-in-law for Catherine's summer vacation, the family's life was shattered by a terrible tragedy. Dawn found Susie laying her life on the table. She rested her head on her folded arms and dozed off. Now she woke up, jumped up. I should have at least turned on the TV. Its noise would have prevented sleep, would have distracted. Catherine had spent the night away from home, spending the night at a friend's house. And Susie knew the girl well, trusted her. What about her? In general, she looked into her son's room a couple times a night to check on him. Not that Susie would be afraid that the homeless woman she brought in would be crazy. No, she almost never feared it. She only ever brought in people who were sober, and she'd long since stopped offering alcohol as payment. That way she was able to weed out suspicious elements from potential candidates for conversation. But still, there were a couple of unpleasant cases. A couple of homeless people broke in. Leaving the room, Mike quietly went to wander around the apartment looking for something to steal. There was another girl who started saying she was underage, wants Susie to adopt her. We had to get her out. I knew for a fact she was lying. She's 25 years old. And in general, in order to protect herself, even if by a dubious method, Susie began very quickly not just to look for random homeless people, but to go to the place of their permanent residence on the heating main. There were a couple of such settlements of homeless people there. It was funny and sad at the same time to see these makeshift tent settlements where the homeless huddled in groups of a few. But the most important thing was that these settlements and homeless people had their own heads, the most sensible and sober people. Of all the homeless people, they were naturally, at first, wary of Susie's strange proposals. But then, realizing that taken, so to speak, for a while girls always return in order, and not empty-handed, with food, things, with medicines. In general, these elders even began to recommend to her suitable candidates for her son. Naturally, Susie did not even hope that the homeless in their environment will keep everything that happens in secret. But here was the surprising thing. They somehow reacted to all this much more adequately than ordinary people. Well, a woman walks around looking for those who agreed to sit for a few hours with her son, who is a little strange and on the head says all sorts of things. So, and this is not a misfortune. It is possible to earn a living in this way. All the more that sometimes, as Susie realized, some of the homeless took something valuable for themselves from communication with Mike, whether he was making predictions or interpreting dreams. Susie didn't care so little for her son out of love for him, but at the same time she tried to distance herself from his madness, and Catherine had told her not to get too involved, as if madness could be contagious, and so they lived, quietly taking care of their little family, and everything seemed to be going well. Susie stopped at the door to her son's room, froze, and then opened it decisively, and the next moment she gasped for air. And a cold wave of terror ran through her body. The sun was shining through the window, and Mike was curled up on his bed. 12 years old, and he's humping a stuffed hippo and sniffling. I would have loved that picture if it weren't for one thing. The thing was that the walls of the room yesterday were covered with 1 ton of cream wallpaper. Now they were covered with writing in Mike's full-height multicolored and black signs, runes, letters of the Icelandic alphabet, Latin and creatures, half beast, half human. Tiny little people. They were twirling in circles, writhing. And in the midst of this painted madness, painted in black ink, was Leo, Susie's husband, who had gone missing the same day her son had gone mad a few years ago. "Good morning, mistress." It came lazily from around the corner, where a homeless woman sat in a tangle like a nest of piled blankets. Susie didn't even have the energy to resent her son for giving her all the bedding in the room. Mike, by the way, was sleeping on a bare mattress. "What a night you had." The homeless woman stretched and nodded at the sleeping man with a grin. "I heard that he can read the future and the past of people. But he was telling me stories all night, and then he went to draw. He mumbled something, but I dozed off. He kind of scratched his armpit, sniffed his fingers and grimaced. He's happy with everything, but he messed up your wallpaper, mother. He's growing up an artist. This country house was built by Joan's great-great-grandfather. The brickwork, skillfully combined in it with wooden elements, 3 floors, plus attic, roof covered with pizza, and decorated with 6 decorative towers, on the highest of which spins a rooster. A weather vane. Around the side of the house was a veranda. Initially behind the glass-stained glass windows, which were badly damaged by looters in the 20s, the descendants only had the sense to recreate them in the mid-70s. Once this house was full of the voices of relatives and children's laughter. On weekends, musical instruments were played here. All the women in their family were excellent musicians, and from the kitchen, where the cooks were busy, there was a mind-boggling smell of pies. There was once a lovely garden around the house, full of roses, the varieties of which were sent straight from England, and later it bore apples, pears, plums, and cherries. They bore fruit generously, to the envy of all the neighbors, because the owners of the house and garden knew the secret of increasing the fertility of plants. But time passed, and little by little, the house and the family in it became lost, all the weight in society, its reputation for wealth, and even the strength of the bonds that bind them. Someone would call it a natural, alas, sometimes inevitable course of things, which according to the mysterious laws of the universe sometimes befalls some families. But Joan had her own most correct opinion on the subject, as she thought. It was all about the fact that over time her family had begun to forget to whom they owed everything they owed in time, respectfully thanked for what they knew how to do. It was all about the fact that the house was not built on a simple site, but where it was a hand's reach to the hidden world where the little people dwelt. Joan, when she was younger, hadn't really believed it. But when her husband died, when her relatives, one by one, who passed away, and who simply abandoned everything, betrayed tradition and left, that's when she realized that these are definitely not fairy tales, and anyone who broke the rules would be in trouble. And she couldn't understand it. How stupid are the people around her? Why can't they see the obvious? They knew about it in other places. Plenty of places. Take Ireland, for example. But progress has reached there too. And in the matter of ignorance, what killed the old days? You've held your ancestral traditions by the roots. And what, pray tell, could have been good about that? Joan had long been retired, but she was young in spirit and was not going to the other world yet, because there were still important things to do. It was necessary to take care of her family. The old woman was rocking quietly in a chair on the veranda when the window was open and the sunlight was pouring in. She had just made tea and was going to drink it with honeycomb. And then to knit for an hour, she deserved a little rest. And before that, as the smart head of her house, she remembered to put a saucer of milk around the corner by the back porch, because they liked to drink milk at sunset. And in her whole life, Joan could count the days when she didn't. But unfortunately, sometimes people in her family wise, no exception, managed to mess with respectable relationships so badly that milk was no longer enough. And a chicken both buried and in the corner of the garden would not do. They expected more. They demanded a special apology, and the fool who didn't follow these centuries-old rules paid dearly. Joan blamed herself more than once for being so foolish as to let her son's wishes get in the way of her misfortune. And this is how it ended. Her son Leo, smart, golden boy, continued the family tradition and became a historian. Joan, who revered history above all other sciences, her Leo promised to be a great man, maybe quite like his grandfather, who had been a university professor until he was almost 90. But then Leo must have been spoiled by his mother and fallen for a nasty girl out of his league. But Joan had some good, smart girls in mind, and Leo could have been a nice wife. But he chose this one, and it was all her fault. She was the one who told Leo, "You're a grown man. Why listen to your mother? Do what you want." And he did, spent with his shamelessly friends, scientists, and these, for whom the ancient traditions are an empty sound, all sorts of archaeological excavations, ravaged the damp earth, disturbed the hills, disturbed those whose peace must not be disturbed. Joan begged me to stop, showed her great-grandfather's journals, told her what such mistakes would do to fools. But no one listened. They laughed and called her superstitious. And then, when one day Leo returned from expedition, where, as he said, they uncovered a mound with the burial of a powerful sorcerer, Joan realized that they'd reached him, and he called down a fierce misfortune on himself. And what else could a mother do? What else could a mother do but save her child? She didn't give a damn when she was about to bring disaster on her son and daughter. That wench of his, Susie, whom Joan had not consented to marry. But she couldn't let the same thing happen to her son, and she did what she had to do. But a little too late. Didn't get him out of danger in time. Missed the time, and those who came from the secret people called elves had once gotten to him. And that's when Joan realized what is actually a cruel trial, which they send as punishment to those who violate their peace. And she endured almost 3 years of torment, as it should be, as the ancient books say. But the third and final year was about to expire, and there was no result. That's when Joan realized they were more cunning and stronger than she thought. Fooled her. But she too, as they say, was no slouch. So Joan opened the safe, took out some gold jewelry and sold it in town. Her, taking advantage of the fact that she was a lonely old woman. She did, of course, pay much less than the real price, but she did not care. The main thing was that the money was enough to buy what she had already agreed on with one collector. He lived in Ireland, and he, out of respect for the memory of her great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather, agreed to sell her these books, antique and necessary items. A good man, many years of good health to him. And now Joan knew exactly what she had to do. The phone rang exactly as Susie closed the door behind the homeless woman and was about to return to her son's room. Mike needed to be woken up, fed breakfast. She decided not to say anything to him about what had happened. Maybe he didn't remember what he'd done. And even if he did, maybe she shouldn't have indulged him so much. Maybe it would have been better not to cancel the medication, just reduce the dosage. But Joan was distracted by the phone. Yes, she answered it without looking at the incoming number, and her eyes rounded because it was her mother-in-law, with whom they had not spoken for a long time. Catherine sat defiantly, having picked up her legs on the seat and jammed the phone on her ears, headphones, and even through them you could hear that she was listening to her favorite heavy metal. Susie had a theory that her daughter should watch less horror movies and listen to less rock. Then maybe she wouldn't be so nervous, but she kept quiet about it. So, things hadn't been great lately. And while Susie was familiar with the theory that there was such a thing as teenage rebellion, it didn't make it any easier, because whatever rebellion a teenager had, and they should realize that a family needs to stick together in tough times, it was as if Catherine was purposely trying to hang her mother out to dry 24/7s. She made excuses when Susie asked her to do the dishes, take out the trash, and clean the apartment, constantly nagging for pocket money too, for clothes, for expensive stationery. She rolled her eyes when flotsam pasta or chicken stew appeared on the table. "I want rolls. Why don't we order pizza?" Catherine could start whining. And Susie had the urge to send the insolent girl to her room without dinner and deprive her of sweets for a week. She couldn't do that to her girl, and she held on. Even tried from the meager family budget, from which it was still necessary to allocate regularly to repay the loan. Tried to please Catherine with something, because young years, so let them be good memories, not one need. And now there was a new cause for conflict. Susie, Catherine, and Mike were taking the intercity bus to visit Joan's grandmother and mother-in-law. Susie at first could not believe her ears when she called to apologize for leaving them, not supporting them for so many years, and then confessed that she really wants to return everything to be a family again. And the mother-in-law also said pitifully, saying that her heart had been bad recently. Then the ambulance came, and the whole life flashed before my eyes. And now that I realize how fragile human life is, I decided to reconcile. "Mom, why do we have to go to her?" Gesticulating vigorously, Catherine protested. "She left us when Dad died. At all did not support you, did not give a penny." "Daughter, listen," tried to explain her view of the situation Susie. "Joan was in a very bad place then, maybe even worse than we were. I mean, she had a son who'd gone missing, and then when he was pronounced dead. But understand, she's an elderly person." "Mom," Catherine squinted suspiciously, "and I understand, Mom, we go to her to make peace, and she began to give us money. Yes, to write a will for us." Susie looked directly at her daughter. What was there to say? Well, yes, Catherine was partly right. Material interest had played its part. Joan, after all, was a very wealthy woman and a pensioner in years. She could really support a small family now, as well as legal bequest in favor of, if not a widowed daughter-in-law, then at least grandchildren. As it happened, Susie had inherited nothing from her husband. Land and house, good auto accounts in the bank, and a vast collection of antiques. It was all cleverly registered to Joan. As Susie later realized, this woman just used to keep everything under iron control and tried so hard to protect her son from mercantile girls. Now they really needed the money. Susie had already missed a loan payment last month. The money set aside for it had gone into repairs, breaking 8 refrigerators. And there was also Mike's tutoring fees to pay. And Catherine had a cavity on her front tooth, so it was time to go to the dentist. All in all, Susie was willing to push her pride far away and make peace with her mother-in-law. After all, her late husband would probably be glad that his mom wasn't alone, that she had a little family too. And so now they were on their way out of town to spend a week for starters at Joan's house, the house where they once thought they would be very happy. "Creepy," Catherine commented, "the scenery outside the window." Susie shrugged her shoulders. There was plenty of wildlife here, and there were forests full of berries and mushrooms. True, tourists there were told to walk carefully, lest they invent into swamps or run into wolves and rats. Mike, to his mother's great relief, behaved quietly. He didn't pick on strangers on the bus, and right now the boy was immersed in the book Fairy Tales, as fairies were also called in Victorian England, Scotland, and Ireland. This richly illustrated book had been brought from somewhere by Catherine. Susie didn't like the theme of the book. It had personal dark associations, but her son had latched onto it like a cancer with his claws. What was there to do? That's where they live all of a sudden, Mike said. He poked first at the spread of the book and then out the window at the woods. Susie threw a glance at the book. There was a winged little man in a cap on a dark green background. Only it didn't look like a bit fairy. It was a freak, to put it bluntly. Deformed, with broken arms, legs, or paws. And it grinned. Susie turned away. I wanted to believe that this book wouldn't give Mike nightmares. He didn't have nightmares without books like this. This book of fairy tales was strangely comforting. Finally, the bus stopped here. From the stop, it was possible to get to the village or dacha communities. And if you walked a little farther, you could get to Joan's house. Susie was the first to move down the aisle. She worriedly sorted her bags from her luggage into the compartment. Someone hadn't mixed up the stuff either. Catherine, keep an eye on your brother, she commanded, already getting off the bus. Yeah, Catherine responded, and without taking off her headphones, pulled Mike's seat. They're over there, said the boy, poking his finger animatedly at another book where a poor shepherd was drawn. It was an illustration in a fairy tale that told of how he had been attracted by the songs and the scent of a treat, left his flock behind, entered the lights as a trophy and spent the night there, making merry by dancing with them. And when he returned the morning to the field, he did not find his herd. When he came to the village, he found out that it had actually been 100 years. They took Daddy away, said the boy with a serious look. Aha, responded Catherine, who did not understand a word of what her brother said. She had heavy metal music blaring at full volume in her headphones. The house was just as Susie remembered it. True, it had fallen into considerable disrepair since then. It wasn't surprising, though. After all, judging by the rumors that had come to light, Joan had taken to living the lifestyle of the ultimate recluse. The porch creaked on the fourth step, and Susie felt the echo of incoming tears. She hastily lost her eyes, pretending to get caught up in the rush. On the eve of his disappearance, Leo had promised that he would fix the porch and that they would meet in the evening for tea on the veranda with blackcurrant jam. It was for berries that she and Mike went that fateful day. And years later, Susie blamed herself. But no matter how much her heart ached, no misgivings. Then she would have told them, "Don't go, my dears, we don't need those currants." But there was nothing of the sort. She waved to her son and husband, who disappeared into the edge of the forest. She was worried that they had not returned already past noon, when the sky was suddenly covered with blue clouds, and it began to rain on the nettles. And in the evening, when they had already called rescuers, they asked for help in the search in the village and at Dacus. The storm played out so badly that it seemed that centuries-old pine trees would be ripped out by the roots. They searched for them for a long time. People were combing the forest, search dogs were yapping, flashlights flickered, rescue helicopter blades whirred. Susie's heart nearly jumped out of her chest when her daughter burst into the summer kitchen and shouted. They found him, except they only found Mike. The boy had turned up at the edge of the swamp, frozen, barely alive from hunger, scared, shivering. And then he broke down, fell completely into his madness. Leo kept looking, but then the locals were the first to give up. There were rumors that the local swamps were almost cursed, that cattle and unlucky hunters disappeared there. Mom. Her daughter's response snapped Susie out of her painful memories. Mom, do I have to carry all the weight? Her daughter stood pouting by the bags. Susie went to help. Joan met the family, and there were hugs, spills, and tears. A lot of awkward phrases were said, which must be generally peculiar to relatives who had not spoken to each other for a long time and then decided to restore family ties. As Joan's age and health did not allow her to take care of the house and grounds, it looked as neglected inside as outside. And some of the rooms stood locked up at all, and much of its furniture was covered with covers of light-colored cloth. They looked like ghosts, frozen waiting for their victims. Catherine whispered ominously in her mother's ear, and she nearly slapped her daughter on the back. It is necessary to be such a fool and irresponsible to talk such passions in front of his mentally unstable brother. And Mike, by the way, behaved surprisingly calm. Susie, by the way, had no one to consult about how dangerous it was for her son's mental health to return to a place where there had been strong traumatic events. But on the other hand, they had no way out, and secondly, the boy must still have many good memories with this place. Joan showed the rooms, one for each of the dear guests. Thank you. "But I'd rather live with him," said Susie. She expected her mother-in-law to say something like, "Don't do it, the boy's a big boy," but she just shrugged her shoulders in agreement. Then she invited everyone into the kitchen. "Would you like some fresh milk?" she offered. "I buy everything fresh, goat's milk of high quality from farmers I know." "Thank you, I'm fine," said Susie. "I love goat's milk." Catherine pounced on the drink and drained the glass in a volley, then poured herself a refill. "Delicious." The girl groaned with astronomical pleasure. "I haven't had something this good in 100 years. Straight 100 years, grinned, shook her mother-in-law's head. The sun was still high, and so Catherine begged her mother's permission to go for a walk. Susie absent-mindedly agreed. She was preparing herself for a difficult conversation with her mother-in-law, who needed to be briefed on Mike's condition. Susie decided that it was definitely not worth talking about his sessions with social personalities, but it was better to warn her that he was a withdrawn boy who sometimes woke up with nightmares. So it is better that in front of him there are no sharp noises and so on. And contrary to her expectations, her mother-in-law reacted normally to all this. "I know," she said. "Mike's not an easy kid. He's been like that since birth." "No, Joan, not from birth. The light side. It started when he was a year old, when they realized he was a little late for his age." She just sighed and waved her hands. "I mean, me and my whole family are healthy. No abnormalities in that regard. And it's just like I've been switched at one moment and that's it." "Yeah, I know," Joan nodded like a switch. "But you know, honey, it's good to know what's going on and what to do about it." For a few minutes there was silence between them, somewhere far away and very quiet. A mouse seemed to be hiding in the underground. "Well, dear," smiled cheerfully mother-in-law. "Tell me, how are things going at work?" Susie smiled. This was the easiest part of the conversation she had planned for the near future. She started talking about how she worked as an accountant. "Yeah, sometimes remotely. It's an established team. But recently a girl student came to them for an internship." Catherine walked along a dusty ribbon path and stretched across a flood meadow. And with nothing to do, pounded the high traumas, picked up a stick somewhere. "This sucks," the girl thought, dragging herself to the middle of nowhere to be stuck in a gloomy house with a crazy old woman who had never heard a good word from her father since his death, probably afraid that not today tomorrow will fall infirm in a nursing home, so sucking up. However, not everything was so simple, it seems, and Catherine could not understand why she became so creepy when they entered the house, and the grandmother closed the door behind them as if they were trapped. And over the windows hung sprigs of mountain ash, and in the door jamb, it seemed stuck a knife, and in the bouquet of wildflowers that stands on the table in the living room added wormwood. Who puts wormwood in a vase anyway? Catherine wrinkled her nose. Maybe Mom's right. She'd seen too many horror movies and her nerves were frayed. "Oh." Catherine froze like a mesmerized, looking at the surface of the meadow grasses wiped out by the wave and under the wind. But they were still moving, as if something was scurrying across the bottom and straight toward Catherine. "Is it a gopher snake?" Although it had to be an anaconda. But before the girl could think of any more grass fauna, a snout popped out, and another one appeared. "Fifi?" confusedly asked Catherine, and she herself did not understand how, but recognized the neighbor's dog literally in the face. "Louis," she said to the second dog, "how did you get here?" "Where's your master?" "I'm here from a sea of grass." Alex popped up, and raising his hand above his head, waved a red plastic disc. "We were playing skeet, so I threw it with all my might. I couldn't find it. I'm visiting my parents." He waved his hand in the direction where far away could be seen a scattering of village houses. "What are you doing here?" Catherine knew that a modern young girl should be strong, independent, and even more so not to brood, not in the presence of men. But right now, she felt like what she was, essentially confused about her relationship to the world and her mother by a teenager with some serious and even ominous anxieties heaped upon her beyond her age. And she told me that they were to flatter herself in front of her grandmother, who was inexplicably in over her head. "Be strong." Alex gave her a friendly pat on the shoulder. "You can play with us. I'm not enough for these two teddies with a propeller." Catherine was very grateful to him for not pouring a wave of pity on her, but just supported it like a boy and offered a concrete case to distract herself. They had a good laugh and chatted about everything a little and agreed that they would meet again. "How was your teacher?" Alex joked goodbye. "I didn't let you take a vacation from art lessons." "What are we going to draw this time?" Catherine asked. Shadows, answered Alex, looking at the sky. The colors, which gradually began to acquire shades of shadows. The contrast of light and darkness sometimes tells us the most important things. But in general, the next few days passed in Catherine's opinion unimaginably boring. On the plus side, though, her mother, at least, was so busy talking to her grandmother that she didn't have time to work her daughter through what she should do with her life after graduation next year. But what Catherine really didn't like here were the nights. In her mind, she knew it was just a stress reaction. Yeah, plus it's an old house and all sorts of creaks and rustles are common. But how eerie it was to wake up in the darkness when the room was flooded with the ghostly cold light of the moon and almost in its shadows, as if there was something alive watching them with evil intent. Sometimes it seemed to Catherine that someone was sneaking down the corridor or peering into her room. Sometimes she heard someone moaning somewhere. But then came the morning, and the girl had breakfast with a big appetite, which a grandmother was not to take away, so it is the ability to bake pies, and ran off to walk in the neighborhood. It was doubly easy, because in the barn she found an old, but still quite on the move bicycle. It became quite suitable for traveling, when it literally in a couple of hours fixed where and how Alex, he by the way, Catherine often complained about the family circumstances. I'm sick of her, rolling her eyes shared the girl, all pestering me to salt the food. And I have explained to her 100 times that I will not, because I'm on a diet without salt. Maybe I should be kinder, she added, with a heavy sigh. It's just that grandma is old, doesn't understand anything. Of course at that time from the care of myself only cucumber masks were. No one ever heard of body diets. You should learn the history of everyday life. Alex grinned. I can give you a list of suitable literature. You'll be surprised. It had been 5 days of visiting. And Susie suddenly said that she had extended her family leave at work, so they're gonna be here for a little while longer. And just as she was announcing the news that morning, something happened. Granddaughter, put the kettle on the stove, Joan asked. I thought you were boiling it just now, muttered Catherine, who was actually looking forward to going out. But she decided to really be kinder, so she went into the kitchen. There's the kettle on the table. I just have to get it. Put it on the stove. There was a cry of pain in the house. What happened? A worried Susie came flying into the kitchen. My arm, Catherine whimpered. It's my grandmother's fault. What? Don't be silly. Let me see. Mom intercepted the teenager's injured limb. Oh, I'll get the first aid kit. Joan, where's your first aid kit? In the living room closet on the top shelf on the left, the older woman answered. She also came running into the kitchen and now pressed her hands to her chest with round eyes, looking at Catherine. Is it very painful? What do you think? The girl replied with a grimace. Did you know it was hot? I remembered. You took it off the stove yourself, holding the handle with a towel. Grandma, why? All right, that's enough. Susie, having returned with everything she needed, began first aid. What the hell are you talking about? Grandma just forgot. Yes, I forgot, Joan nodded. She and Catherine looked at each other very carefully. And Catherine realized with horrified indignation and also with fear that Granny had forgotten nothing. She had done it on purpose, and somehow it also seemed that she was capable of more than that, because what goes on in this house is not what it seems. A couple hours later, when Catherine did apologize, not under pressure from her mother, but after deciding that it was better this way. And when everyone calmed down and ate breakfast, the little family of 3 went to the village to the store. Joan, citing high blood pressure, stayed behind. Yes, it wasn't easy. Living with strangers was an inconvenience, both ordinary in everyday life and very specific. The clock struck 3 in the afternoon. Susie and the children would be back soon. Joan came back into the house from the vegetable garden. She kept a small vegetable garden where she planted the most unpretentious things. She went into the kitchen and put a large bundle of greens in the sink. The weather was hot. It was time to make soup, and she would make it. She'd already taken care of the rest of the chores around the house. Joan's eyes slid over the floor and the basement, she thought. All is well, and soon it will be even better. And then when he comes back, it'll be just as good as it should be. And they'll all be happy, and she'll even be able to forgive her naughty daughter-in-law for everything. Who are you? Who are you? Slowly, rinsing, serving, and finally chopping the greens, Joan wrote. Are you a witch, or are you a fairy? Or are you a consort? She giggled, shook her head, and wagged a finger at the void. No, Joan thought. That's not the way it's going to work. A line of that old Irish teasing song would fit her case. But except that she was absolutely convinced that Susie was an ordinary human woman, the wife of her son Leo. The rest of them are complicated, but she'll get over it. The important thing is to keep at it, because there's only so much time left. I think Mom is so angry because it will soon be the anniversary of the disappearance of Dad, Catherine said quietly to Alex. It just so happened that she and her mom and brother met Alex on the way to the store. Susie was surprised, but then he said he was visiting family and with all his incredible charm invited them on a mini tour of the farm and cheese factory. Susie politely agreed, and now Catherine and Alex were touring the farm, a little apart from the others. Be patient. She's got a lot of responsibility for the two of you, Alex replied in the girl's tone. Let's change the subject. I think you should be more attentive to what I'm explaining to you. You made a mistake again in yesterday's lesson. Catherine, since when do you think I mean? The two of them almost jumped and looked at each other, like conspirators caught off guard, which was true. And what kind of lessons are you giving my daughter? She insisted to the man with her index finger. What's going on? Susie, don't worry, I'll explain everything. Alex stepped forward, while Catherine literally hid behind his shoulder from her angry mother. The thing is, I'm teaching Katia how to draw. She wants to be an artist in the future. What? Susie's eyes widened. Actually, if she had heard such news at another time and place, she would have reacted much more calmly. But right now, she was already on edge. Are you out of your mind? What am I slaving away at my job for? Thinking about how to pay for tutors so you'll do well on your exams, so you can get into your stupid art school? No, honey. Susie pounded her fist on the wall with such force that she was in the stall. And they were now walking through the area where the cows were kept, mooing unhappily. As long as you live in my house, you will do as I say. So when I turn 18, I won't be living there. Catherine flamed back, of course. Is Mike the only one you can mess around with? Is he the only one you love? Because he's stupid, and he'll always be obedient to his mommy. He won't disappoint you like me, a man who can have an opinion. For a few minutes there was silence in the little company. Rustling, mooing in the tables, tension seemed to hang in the air, as it does before a thunderstorm. Mike wasn't with them. He was in the yard with Alex's parents, showing him the horses living on the farm. Are you 18 yet? Susie's eyes glittered dangerously, and there was a steel in her voice, a steel that restrained other people's stiffness. Not yet. Then march with me. I said you'll stay in the house, right? And you? She snorted. I didn't expect that from a neighbor so decent looking. Don't you dare come near my daughter, clearly. Mom, exclaimed Catherine, you can't please. Alex is my only friend. He and I are. Yes, he's the best. Catherine. Alex put his hand on the young girl's shoulder soothingly. Go with Mom. She's right. By all rules, you are still a child now, and you can't do anything you want at all. She didn't answer. She just looked him in the eyes for a long time, and then sobbed and shook her head and rushed out of the barn into the yard. Alex saw them off with a thoughtful look. He was really sorry that everything had turned out so ugly. He was also uneasy. Anxiety because of what he had learned in the last few days, something coming from the distant past, did not give him peace, and he decided that it was necessary to sort it all out. Outside the window, as if to order. That is, in keeping with Catherine's mood, the rain was falling. The punishment of being cooped up in four walls was hardly a second day, and it felt as if she had been locked up for a century. She didn't feel like doing anything. She couldn't help in the kitchen. It was terrible to look at the burns on her arm. And so Catherine settled down in a small room, which served as a library and study in the house. To be more precise, it had been like that before, when Papa was alive. And before him, his grandfather and great-grandfather had worked in it. Now it was just a room, a little neglected, dusty, and filled from top to bottom with books. But Catherine was cozy here. She was left alone for a while, and she could sit and listen to sad music and look out the window. At some point the girl thought to read, but after a quick look at the spines of books, decided that it is unlikely that in the library of hereditary scientists, historians, and culturologists will find something interesting to her. So the only thing left to do was to be sad, to watch the gray-silver stream of rain streaming down the glass, illuminated now and then by flashes of lightning. And remember how nice it had been to walk in the meadow with Alex and his two dogs. And also right now, for some reason, Catherine found the strength to admit to herself that when she became an adult, She would be 18 years old already. She probably wanted to get married soon, to be behind someone like a stone wall. And she'd like that person to be a lot like Alex. Just like him to be. Catherine smiled dreamily and propped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Tangled herself more tightly in the warm plaid she dragged here from her room. She remembered how they had walked, laughed, talked about everything. He told her all sorts of interesting things about these places. So Granny's ancestors were some kind of landowners here? Catherine asked. There were indeed those who even owned serfs, Alex answered. But Joan's ancestors were famous not as successful landowners, but first of all as scientists, experts in folk culture, folklore of Europe, including England and Ireland. Also, their education was bizarrely combined with superstitiousness. No offense to them. Granny probably believes in the housekeeper. Catherine grinned. I've seen her leave a saucer of milk outside the house. In general, that's how they pay the housekeeper. Alex said thoughtfully, but in this family more honored always small people. And who is it? Asked the girl. They have many names. Elves, fairies, pixies, and more than that. And elves, laughed Catherine, forest beauties who dance in the flowers, and they also help Santa Claus at the North Pole. Yes? There are versions of that too. Answered her with a warm smile, man, but folk beliefs, coming from the Middle Ages and times earlier, paint them far from being so harmless. And Alex told her how dangerous fairies could be in ancient beliefs. My dad wouldn't have believed in such things, she sighed. He was a materialist. And in fact, as I remember, he used to make fun of my grandmother for believing all that stuff. Actually, Alex said thoughtfully, such faith is not always harmless. In Victorian England, there were sometimes cases when people who believed that their neighbors or relatives were no longer human did terrible things. The thunder outside the window seemed to hit almost the sill, and Catherine shuddered, but not from it. It was just that everything in her head suddenly began to fit together like a mosaic. What had been happening to them lately, what Alex had been talking about. It can't be. The girl exhaled and jumped up from her chair. Walked around the room. Yes, it can't be, she said and froze. Or maybe, she added and rushed over to one of the closets. Judging by the lack of dust on many of the books, they had been used more often than others. Catherine was thrashing around. She wanted to test her theory, and felt like a complete fool for doing so. And besides, what made her think she'd get her hands on the right one right away? She pulled out books, looked at the titles and put them back. All wrong. But what was it? A book in a black cover. Golden Shyness. Mythological Beliefs in Scotland in the second half of the 19th century. Aloud she read the title and opened where the bookmark had been left. Helping herself with her finger, she ran down the lines, snatched up the subject of the text, and rounded her eyes in stunned shock. This book said that some villagers in remote lands believed in the ability of fairies to send changelings to people. For example, if a child was born in a family, and then parents suddenly noticed that there was something wrong with him, he was sick a lot, did not learn to walk or talk, they could decide that it was the fairies and took the healthy little man to their kingdom. And in return they planted their own cub. And then it was no longer enough to placate the small people with rich offerings. The changeling had to be chased away, and the right way to do this was to cause him severe pain. Then, according to the legends of the Therians, unable to bear the spectacle of their cub suffering, had to take it away and bring back the stolen human. According to mystical beliefs, something similar fairies could also do with adult humans, but their kings usually when not careful fools dared to walk on those hills or leafy hills that were said to belong to the little people. Getting rid of an adult changeling was much more difficult, but it was also possible. The main thing was, as believed, not to believe the liars, who of course would never admit that he or she was from the people of the fairies, and also to use the right amulets, incantations and magic potions, salt, neat iron, thistle, wormwood. Catherine read and a chill crept up her spine. She just couldn't believe it. She was just terrified, because if Nana's ancestors believed it, why shouldn't she herself be on the same side, especially with everything Catherine had been noticing lately? She rushed out of the room, needing to talk to her mom right away, and let her scold her, but she had to listen to her. Catherine didn't want to stay here another minute. She was really scared. Mommy called the girl. And Mommy is not their granddaughter. She heard her grandmother's voice. Joan came out of the kitchen, soft warm light from the lamps. Grandma is wearing an apron the color of this apron. She smiles, wiping her hands with a towel, smells deliciously warm pie. For a moment, Catherine felt like she was snapping out of a bad dream. What a fool! She watched her horror movies and fantasized about something unknown. Now Granny will call them to tea, and they will spend the evening over a cake. "Mounty's gone to town," Granny said, and smiled broadly. Her face shone with the joy of a man who had just been given a year's worth of presents and couldn't wait to open them all at once. The neighbors called. "They're flooding the place." "I thought we shut off the water when we left," Catherine muttered. The idyllic picture in her head was beginning to fade like a piece of paper thrown into a flame. "I know," Nana nodded. "It's time we had a talk. You, me, the one who pretends to be my grandchildren, and the one whose return I await most of all. Come here, sweetheart. Don't be silly." Grandma dropped the towels carefully, and Catherine realized what she was hiding underneath. Cold steel glinted in the light of the flames cast by the large fireplace raised in the room. Alex had not been resting lately, but thinking very hard and seriously. His parents weren't getting any younger, and basically there were brothers who ran the family business perfectly. But now being in touch with everything again, Alex suddenly thought about the fact that he might be able to combine, if he tried very hard, both his favorite painting and farm business. He realized that life in the city, with all its advantages, was also not without its disadvantages. And now he was slowly starting conversations with his folks that perhaps, if they didn't mind, he could give it a try. His parents were fine with it, and neither were his brothers, but relaxing and enjoying himself. To relax so easily, in the company of his two pugs, wasn't working, and that was because of Catherine and her family. Something was wrong. Alex talked to family and neighbors who knew anything about Joan. Not much. Ever since her son went missing and was declared dead, she became a recluse. She'd only go into the city and the country once in a while. And so everything she needed was brought to her by delivery. The locals felt sorry for her, saying that perhaps the old woman had lost her mind. It was the second time in her life she'd suffered such grief. The first one happened when Joan was a little girl, when her mother ran away from the family with her lover. She sent word afterwards, but it didn't make anyone feel much better. And Joan's grandmother was alive at the time. She wouldn't let the child rest. She said that her mother did not just run away, but seduced her by a native of the people of fairies and took her away to a magical land and enchanted her. Then, of course, when Joan got out of kindergarten age, she stopped believing in this nonsense. And her own grandmother, by the way, ended her days as a mad woman, and some people said it was hereditary. In their family, everyone experiences grief differently, shared with Alex, one of the neighbors' Angs, from whom Joan, as it turned out, several times a year bought honeycomb with honey. Sometimes we remember we stand Leo, what a good man he was. And she'd say, "Why not?" as if he were still alive and well, and she'd seen him yesterday. There you go. Alex never thought of himself as paranoid, but something about this picture always confused him. What Catherine was so afraid of at night. Why was Joan so nervous about what she was saying? So one day the girl was sent for pickles for dinner. In the refrigerator the jar was empty, and she decided to go down to the basement. After all, it is known that significant supplies are usually stored there, so she went to where there was a hatch in the floor. When she saw that it was locked, she wanted to go and ask for the key. But then her grandmother came flying up. She yelled at her not to touch anything in the house. Then Granny held the lock and smirked, covered the cellar lid with a mat, and said that the cucumbers were still there, just standing in the other refrigerator. There were two in the kitchen, and Catherine forgot to look in the second one. It would seem like an ordinary episode like this, but what was wrong with it? "She eats for two," Catherine once said. She said I was the one who needed to lose weight. Sometimes she'll put 2 plates on the table. When we have already eaten, then she looks at us so strange and removes the extra food, mumbling that she messed up. But I once saw her sneak a bunch of cutlets into her room. Anyway, Catherine's given up. We're living in a madhouse. And I don't need her money. I could have gone back to the city by now. Alex thought about all this as he walked back from the meadow. It had just stopped raining, and he was taking the pugs out for an evening walk. He was just approaching his parents' house when suddenly a delivery car pulled up next to it. "Hey man," the guy behind the wheel waved at him. Alex approached. "Listen, I'm on shift, and my wife is having a baby. I'd like to get to town as soon as possible," said the driver. "You're a local." "All right," he continued. When Alex nodded affirmatively. "Could you pass the order then?" It's already paid for. It's fine. Joan, you know her? Here's the order. The guy jumped out of the car and handed Alex a package. What's this? He asked. Nothing criminal, he chuckled. Courier. Men's clothes, some home clothes, also a collar and a chained dog leash. But thanks to you, man, you helped me out. Alex stood confused, looking at the package in his hands, then in the direction where the order was to be delivered. And then something clicked in his head. Dad, he called his father from the yard and handed him a leash of pugs. Dad, I have to run. Get some help. It looks like a man's been kidnapped at Joan's house. Dad, get some help. And Alex ran. Consciousness came back hard and jerkily, as if she were trying to assemble the colored glass, slipping from her fingers into a stained glass picture. It was cold, stiff, and before she even opened her eyes, Catherine realized she was lying on something hard. She wanted to jump up, but her legs, as well as her hands, were bound tightly. Everything was blurring before her eyes, bright spots dancing. Oh no, she was just looking at the flickering flames. How many of them were there? Candlesticks, antique-looking lamps, and a fireplace. The girl realized she is still in the parlor, but now she is lying helplessly like a game prepared for a feast, on the big table with a gag in her mouth. She woke up, the pale, gaunt face of her grandmother looming over her. From behind the lenses of her glasses, it seemed that she had not two but four eyes, and they looked unkind. Shut up, she said, wagging her finger. When Catherine was protestingly silent and lingering in her boots, and then she saw her brother. He was sitting on the floor and was also bound, only his hands were joined behind his back. And then Catherine noticed another figure, and judging from the posture and immobility, though she sat on the floor, she assumed it was also a captive or captives. No, it's not Mom, answered the grandmother to the question, which the girl from behind the clip could not voice. Do not be afraid, I really sent her to the city, and she will stay there until morning. The buses don't run at night. No, we don't need her here. When will she be back? Granny grinned and wiped her tears on her granddaughter's face. That's when it'll all be over. Catherine would have squealed with horror, could not, and it turns out the grandmother planned to get rid of them. And then Joan, as if she had read these thoughts too, spoke again. And what she said made Catherine freeze and listen, in astonishment bordering on disbelief, because it all sounded like something that might have happened a couple centuries ago in some backwoods place, but not in the modern world with educated people. I knew right then that they had taken him, my boy, my only son. They took him and sent a stranger to replace him. They thought they'd trick me, but how can a mother's heart be deceived? She grinned and shook her head, a changeling. I realized I had to save him, and the opportunity presented itself. I followed them when they went to pick currants, remember? Actually, I thought Leo would go alone. It would have been easier that way, but I had to go to a lot of trouble for this little rascal. In Granny's hand was some kind of carved wooden rod. It was studded with colored stones, and she waved it in Mike's direction. He was the first changeling. I thought I'd make a quick buck, only he was tough. He took off running. I thought he'd stay in the woods. He died there. But where have you ever seen a fairy's offspring disappear into the woods? He came out, but after that, he got all weird. Well, it happens, but I'm the only one who can take it easy. The main thing is that I had my son with me. Why should I return other people's children when I have my own? I know what you're saying. Joan wagged her finger at Catherine. My own grandchildren. I don't believe it. Your mother was a whore. But I forgave her. I forgave her for my son's sake. And if he loves her, let him live with her. He'll be a father to you. I mean, not to you. Joan stood still for a couple of minutes, frozen, bowed her head, thinking about something, frowning. 3 years is exactly how long it takes to get Fairy to take the changeling back. Yes, to get the man back from the enchanted realm. Ah, the things I've done. I tried everything I can think of to scare them into giving me Leo back. But the changeling just won't budge. Well, that's all over tonight. Somehow Catherine managed to push the gag out of her mouth, and her first impulse was, of course, to scream for help. She would have. Only what's the point if you're in a house that stands far away from any other dwelling? And then Granny would definitely put the gag back in place. And this way, Catherine realized she had a chance to figure out what was going on, because it might be useful for rescue. But Daddy was missing. He was lost on the moors. He's dead, the girl whispered. Silly girl. Joan walked over to the mysterious figure who was also sitting on the floor. She was dressed in a hooded robe, and her head was covered by a hood. Your father is the one who agreed to assume kinship with you. He's alive. The fairy stole him and sent this instead. With those words, Granny pulled the hood off the figure's head, and Catherine froze. It seemed to her that the room had run out of air, that her heart had stopped running. For it was her father Leo. The hair on his head was badly grown back, his gaunt face hidden by a beard. But it was definitely him. And he recognized her. Catherine's gaze darted over his hands and feet. They were in terrible marks. What had been done to him? And who was the one who was still in this room? His own mother? Was such a nightmare possible? And right now, the grandmother was colorfully listing all the herbal potions, the supposedly magical potions she was feeding her captive in hopes of driving the changeling away. She listed all the ways she tried to get Fairy to come after her tribesmen and bring back the real Leo. Daughter, suddenly Joan's captor said. His voice sounded dry, but it was full of tenderness, of boundless fatherly love. Daughter, son, he looked now at Mike. Everything will be all right. Leo's face contorted strangely, and Catherine realized he must be trying to smile, but he'd forgotten how to do it. He wasn't good at it. It's going to be all right, he said. How you've grown. Shut up. Joan said, you damn brat, how dare you hold the guise of my son? But nothing. For 3 years I've put up with you. But now I will make your tribe undo what they have done. In the books, her voice grew quieter, and the hand free from the rod stroked some old volume in the books of the ancients, said how to solve my misfortune. On the night when the deadline for the return of the changeling expires, must call the fairies and make them take away what belongs to them. It says it all. There are ancient rules. Are you kidding me? Joan jumped up angrily. Catherine. Yes, just the situation for humor was not suitable at all, but the girl was literally shaking with laughter. It's just that you're talking about returns like you're gonna return a defective appliance to the store. But you know, the period for the exchange of goods and all that. Catherine stopped laughing only when a slap fell on her face. Tears rose in her eyes, not from resentment, but from pain. And a nasty metallic taste appeared in her mouth. Daddy whispered the girl was crazy, stupid. She was not afraid to look, without averting her gaze, and said what she thought. What kind of mother of her own son will kidnap and ban like a maniac? So he, Daddy. Do. Catherine finally full. The meaning of what happened came through in all its colors. He's been here all these years. Did you keep him in the basement or the attic? The basement, Grandma answered. You can't keep a changeling in the attic. He could grow wings and fly away. And I wasn't kidnapping, I was rescuing. Because she's the one who pointed her hand in Leo Fairy's direction. He's just pretending to be human. But tonight it ends, and I can force him to give me my son back. He'll just disappear. And my son, my Leo. Joan sobbed. Tears streamed from her eyes and snot from her nose, but she didn't even try to wipe them away. They'll come back to me, come down from the hills, come out of the woods, and we'll live happily ever after again. And my grandchildren will come back to me as little and pretty as they were. And how will you do that? Asked Catherine, feigning sincere interest. She suddenly remembered that in the movies sometimes the protagonist of the main character forces his opponent, the main villain, to reveal all his terrible plans, and so drags on until help arrives, but only on whom they had to hope in this situation. Catherine was afraid there was no one, unless it was morning soon and her mother would be back. But she knew it wouldn't be morning soon. How are you gonna make him? I mean us changelings to leave, if you couldn't handle it in 3 years, and somehow you didn't catch us like him. You wouldn't have made it, Joan shrugged. I couldn't keep track of 3. And then I didn't care that you existed. What I really want is Leo. You're asking how I get you crafty elves to go away and give me back my kin. Joan, walking over to the fireplace, tossed more logs into it. The ancient books say that if no remedy has helped, then it is necessary to use the fire that answers the evil, and the flames that embrace the fairy in a moment will make the cursed creature disappear. True, it is still said in wise ancient books that this method should be used if nothing else does not help. And I think that's the case here. Time is running out. I must get my son back. And with these words, Joan lowered into the fireplace a rod, which, it turned out, was a torch. She held it confidently, and the glow of the flame was reflected in her eyes. So, who should I start with? I guess with you. Nasty little fairy, she said, moving closer to Catherine, a naughty, nasty little fairy. Not only did you take the form of my granddaughter, but you ate all the strawberries from my garden 3 years ago. It all seemed so unreal to Catherine. Is this really happening to them? And her father is there, exhausted, shackled in arms and legs iron, but alive. And is her grandmother coming to her now? She may not be perfect, but she's still family. And she's getting ready to use fire to make her disappear. Because, you see, she's a fairy. But before the irreparable could happen, the door to the house suddenly burst open. It was literally broken down, and on the threshold, in the light of powerful flashlights, Catherine saw Alex. Behind the backs loomed a few more village men. Further events over the next few days and weeks merged for Catherine and her family into a stream of events, motley and as whimsically jumbled as glass and kaleidoscopes, assembling into a variety of pictures. The people who took Alex's word for it and risked going with him were shocked by what they saw with their own eyes. Leo was rushed to the hospital. He was in a terrible state, but as the doctor said, he had no life-threatening injuries, and even his mind was still intact. Susie just fainted when she found out her husband was alive. And what happened to the children? But the most striking and startling change was happening to Mike. It turned out that what had happened had hit him like repeated severe stress, a terrible trauma, and it was as if something had clicked in the boy's head. After that, his mental health began to improve at an astonishing rate. Joan was referred to a mental health clinic. The doctor said she was just crazy and couldn't seem to take responsibility for her actions. But she didn't spend much time there. Just one day she suddenly became hysterical. She was telling everyone that fairies had snuck into the ward, disgusting fairies that looked like wild animals, and they were mocking her, threatening to enslave her and take her away with them. And then Joan suddenly died instantly of a heart attack. "Catherine, what are you doing?" asked Alex to his young friend, who, sitting on a bench in the park, flooded in tears. "My grandmother died." "Actually, Joan wanted to," began Alex, but she interrupted him. "I know what she did and what she wanted to do. And she's still my grandmother. She was different once. It's not her fault she went crazy." And the girl also lowered her voice. "I'm afraid that one day I'll go crazy too. They say it runs in the family. Maybe it's hereditary." "It will never happen to you, I promise," Alex said. "How would you know?" She looked at him incredulously. "Because I have a secret remedy." "What is it?" "You'll find out in a year. It will be my coming-of-age present." By the time Catherine turned 18, many more changes had happened. Mike got so much better that he could even attend regular school. He also began to talk freely with people and now seemed like a normal teenager. He often talked about his future and said that he wanted to become a historian, like his father, and that maybe one day he and Leo would write a book about Celtic mythology and study the legendary stone circles that, according to the legends, could transport people to other worlds. Susie, by the way, didn't like such ideas. But what could she do? She could barely cope with her own worries. She could now return to her beloved husband. It was as if they were getting used to each other all over again, learning to live together. Despite all the dark shadows of the past, the family decided to live in that very country house in which they made repairs. They restored everything they needed, and Leo, with his own hands, fixed that very violin, the highest step in the porch. Moreover, early one morning, when everyone was asleep, he went to the woods and came back with blueberries. Then he brought the berry into the kitchen and said that now his wife could make jam out of it. Catherine's 18th birthday was celebrated modestly in a small family circle and in the company of the best. Alex was among the invitees. "Mommy, Daddy," said the girl, "I have something important to tell you. I've decided on my future profession." "And what will you be?" the daughter asked Susie. "Food technologist," answered Catherine and took Alex's hand. "My future husband's family thinks he could use such a business professional. I'll help create new recipes." "Husband?" Leo asked absent-mindedly. He, unlike Susie, was theoretically satisfied with his future son-in-law, but he was a little embarrassed by the haste of events. "They're getting married. What's not to understand?" Mike shrugged. "When are we going to cut the cake?" he asked his sister. "Right away. What a sweet tooth you have." Catherine laughed, and they continued to celebrate and rejoice in the present and plan a happy future. It was a clear autumn day, and it seemed that summer had come back especially for someone to have a wonderful holiday. In the meadow near the forest, dragonflies were flying over the last flowers and their colorful, semi-transparent wings glistened in the sunlight. It was just like the wings of fairies and elves in the pictures Alex had drawn in his next book.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.